We pick up our story with Deku making his way home, and all while this happens, Aizawa would be left in the classroom, just sitting in silence, as he ponders to himself, what in the world is he going to do? On the one hand, he can snitch out Deku, and on the other one, he's going to be losing a very powerful asset to the battlefield, and that's just not something that Aizawa was willing to risk. He would much rather have Deku be a student who has a little bit of a past than for Deku to be roaming around in the streets and having to face off against Deku. If what Deku told him about how Deku realistically could have killed him easily, then Aizawa and many of the other heroes might not stand much of a chance if Deku was truly to try to come after them. I mean, he has heard about talks about how Deathstroke, the anti-hero slash vigilante, has been seen to have taken out a couple of heroes, and those heroes ended up having some very shady pasts. So Aizawa decides ultimately that the best course of action would probably be to just keep Deku on their side, and so he remains quiet, thinking that, like I said, it's better to have him as a hero than to have him as a villain, you know? And eventually, what would pretty much end up happening is that class would start the very next day. And on this particular day, Deku would be told about the school festival. Now, the day before that, Deku was expecting an address or something from the people who told him he can get a quirk, but he got no replies. This day, however, when he would be in class after school would end, he would finally get a message back telling him to meet up at a certain location. And once Deku would be told about the sports festival, and Uraraka would have her moment of just absolutely being way too excited, and all of the other people who were part of general studies and class 1B and stuff like that would go check out the competition by going to class 1A. Deku would clear a path with nothing but his intimidating presence and make his way home. Once there, he takes a slight detour, making his way towards a strange alleyway, and once he would arrive, he would see none other than that purple misted creature who caught him off guard the last time. Deku looks towards the direction of Kurogiri and says that if he ever tries that thing again without his consent, he promises he'll find every weakness inside of him and kill him. And Kurogiri would be visibly shaken up by that, even though Kurogiri doesn't ever feel like that, but Deku just gives off this aura of like, I will mess you up if you cross me, you know what I mean? And so what would pretty much end up happening is that Deku would make his way towards All For One, and All For One would clap and say, the man of honor. Well, looks like you're finally gonna accept my terms and conditions, eh? And Izuku would say, not quite. I'm only here to hear you out. And if you try something, I promise you, you will die. All For One says, funny. As from here, Izuku says, I wasn't kidding. And from here, All For One would say, whatever, look, moving on. I have a special job for you. I've seen many of the missions and I've heard many stories about the fabled Deathstroke. You've managed to become just as famous as I have in 3.5 years. Very interesting thing that is. So I have a proposition for you. I know that you won't accept a heavy amount of money, but maybe, just maybe, you would accept a quirk for this job. And Izuku would say, and what job exactly is that? Continuing to feed you information on the students so you could kill them? And All For One says, oh, the students? That's laughable. Hardly. I don't want the students. I'm after All Might. That's the only person I care about. And Izuku would say, you're after the symbol of peace himself. Interesting. Well, if you ask me, I think he could take you on. And All For One would say he probably could take me on if I didn't have over 100 quirks. And Deku would say that that's impossible. Nobody can harbor that many quirks. All For One would then use 2 quirks at the same time, and he would say it's probably just a double quirk, followed with All For One using 3 and telling him that he is somebody who has access to multiple quirks. He's somebody on the dark web that many people don't even know about, a legend of sorts. His name is All For One. And Izuku would say, oh, that's you. I thought you were fake, but now that I meet you in the flesh, I see that those weren't just stories. Look, it depends on the quirk. What do you have to offer? Because I don't just want anything. Give me an enhancement quirk, and maybe we can talk about things. And if I think you're holding out on me, then we have no deal. And All For One would smirk and say, trust me, kid. I can offer you something incredible. I can offer you 2 quirks. An enhancement quirk which can enhance everything about you. Speed, strength, agility, adrenaline, regeneration, you name it. It'll be enhanced so much that you won't even recognize. You'll break past the limitations of your quirklessness and become powerful. And Deku would say, that's cool and all, but he wants one other quirk, maybe a support quirk. And All For One would say that he can grant him access to a quirk called Airwalk. It'll allow him to use his sniper-like abilities to a next level, being able to be on points where people can't even know where he's at, considering that he can simply just walk on air. And Deku would say, those two quirks do sound interesting. Look, I'm game, but when it comes to All Might and killing him, I can't exactly tell you I'll be killing him anytime soon. I would much rather like to bide my time and catch him in a time of off guard, kind of in the same way that you guys attacked last time. Maybe we can work something like that out. And All For One would say, it can very much be arranged. I'll be ready to contact you. And Deku would say, I'll now be ready to answer. As All For One would hand him the quirk, and Deku would stand up straight, as All For One would like he would put his hand on his face, and then he would give one of the quirks that he has inside of All For One to Deku, and Deku would slightly twitch at the pain that he would feel, but ultimately he would fall onto one knee and say, is that it? And All For One would say, yeah, Kurigiri, take him home. And Izuku would say, you can just take me where you picked me up. You're not taking me home. Kurigiri would take him there, and ultimately Izuku the very next day would end up finding himself in the midst of the sports festival. It would be here that Deku would end up arriving at the festival itself, changing into the cool little outfit that they all wore, and then we time skip to Bakugo giving the speech. He would be telling everybody that he's gonna win. And then everybody would kind of begin to boo at Bakugo, and people would hate Class 1A even more than before, but Bakugo, he just doesn't care. Bakugo genuinely could not care less what other people think of him. It's only whatever he thinks of himself. So Bakugo just lets everybody know that he's the best and he's willing to prove it. He's gonna back it up. But for now, what would pretty much end up going down is that Izuku would find himself in the midst of a quirked race. Todoroki would immediately start everything off by freezing the floor. Deku would jump up into the air and using his agility would be able to just slide his way through the ice, ultimately beginning to run as fast as he can, and then a robot would begin trying to punch at him. Deku would then jump up into the air, jump on top of the robot's arm and run on top of it, as suddenly, using a support gear item, he would shoot a grappling hook onto the top of another 0-pointer and basically glide his way towards the air through the section of the 0-pointers, leading to Kirishima getting absolutely obliterated by one of the 0-pointers who would stop him, and ultimately Deku, using his insane superhuman speed, would do very phenomenally in the race. However, he wouldn't get first place or second. Those two go to Todoroki and Bakugo. Let's say he gets third place or something. Eventually though, after that, we would have the cavalry battle, which I always despise covering, so I'm just gonna skip it. Just know the same people that would have passed in the original past, and then we now find ourselves with Deku versus Shinso. This match is gonna be a very easy one, considering that Deku has trained himself so much and he has so much discipline that he really doesn't care what Shinso says to him. He would say something about how Deku is blessed with quirks, and Deku just stays quiet. He literally just blitzes in, punches Shinso one good time in the mouth for saying that, and then kicks him out of the stage. As Shinso is quickly eliminated and would be like, why? Why wouldn't you say anything back to me? And Deku would say that he doesn't have to. And Shinso would smirk after catching Izuku, with the thing. But Deku, using nothing but his willpower, breaks out. And Shinso would be shocked that somebody could do that. But Deku would simply wink at him with his only eye, and then from here, he would proceed to look at the direction of Todoroki's name, and his own names get moved up on the leaderboard. Knowing that he has to face off against Todoroki, and that Todoroki's always holding back, he decides that it's not even worth fighting him. Eventually, when the battle rolls around, Izuku immediately lifts his hand up and says, I quit. And Todoroki would be shocked. He'd be like, why are you quitting? And Deku would say that he's too weak. Not to mention he's only going to use half of his power anyway, so there's no point with Deku fighting him. It'll be a one-sided massacre anyways. Todoroki getting angry, and Deku says that there's no point in fighting somebody who's not going to go all out. It's disrespectful. So you can go ahead and sit there with all your disrespect, because I'm not doing it. And then he would add a little extra bit of disrespect by saying something about how his dad's quirk is a lot better. And Todoroki, getting angry, would shoot flames at the direction of Deku through nothing but rage. And Deku would quickly turn, dodge the flames, and then with his gun, which, it would actually be a real one, he would shoot a bullet straight at the direction of Todoroki's shoulder, completely injuring his side where he has fire, and then walking his way off of the stage, with Present Mike saying that Deku was allowed those gadgets because he is actually quirkless, and everybody would be shocked, saying that a gun's a bit overkill. Deku saying that a quirk is a bit overkill. The ability to burn a human alive with nothing but your quirk, that's overkill. The ability to fill an entire stadium with ice, that's overkill. So don't say nothing to him. And then he ultimately leaves the area, and the real reason that he would have quit was just because he would honestly rather keep his cards hidden, be more mysterious. He doesn't want his future opponents to know everything there is about him, you know? So he walks off, and then what would pretty much end up happening after this is that Todoroki would get healed up quickly by Recovery Girl, and eventually we would have a battle between Bakugo and Todoroki taking place. Bakugo wins since Todoroki would be slightly injured and he still would refuse to use his fire side, and eventually afterwards we would find ourselves back in the classroom, in which Midnight would end up arriving and asking everybody for what their names are going to be as pro heroes. And Deku, he picks the name Slade. She would wonder why he's using his real name, and Deku would say that, you know, he just likes it. So his hero name is going to be Slade. And Deku's perfectly fine with that. But right as he was about to completely confirm that, he'd be like, wait, I think I want to change my mind. I want my pro hero name to be the Terminator. And she'd be like, kind of non-heroic, like, don't you think? And Deku says he doesn't care. Name sounds badass and he wants to go with that. And she's like, all right, the Terminator it is. And the whole class is like, isn't that a name from a guy in the movie? And Deku says, he got nothing on me. I'm the real Terminator, the real deal. Eventually they all have to pick their agencies, and after class would end, Izuku would walk over towards Aizawa, telling him that he wants to intern with him, that he has some matters to attend to, and that he would like Aizawa to come with him, saying that the way that Aizawa holds himself and presents himself, it's interesting to Deku. And even though they may not see eye to eye with everything that Deku's done, Deku has been finding the hero killer very interesting, and he wants to find out his motives, what he's doing, and if it doesn't benefit them, and if he can convert him to the hero side, then he'll just take him out. And Aizawa would say that he can't exactly do that, but Deku would say that, oh, well, okay, like that's fine. If you can't do that, then it looks like I'm going to have to spread all this info that I have about UA all over the place. Not to mention all the addresses of all the pro heroes that are here at the school, you know, the ones that I have in this hand. He gives him a hard drive, and Aizawa would say that there's no way he has all that information. Deku would say, try me. And then Aizawa puts it inside of a laptop. The USB shows him his location, his house, his wife, his cats, like literally everything. Deku already knows everything about him, and Aizawa would be just stunned. So he ultimately has to agree with Izuku, and they would make their way towards Hosu City. Nothing would really happen, and Deku would pretty much just spar with Aizawa, being in an abandoned warehouse gathering as much intel as they can, and crashing at a hotel as well, as that's pretty much what those days would pretty much consist of. Deku and Aizawa would not exactly see eye to eye by the end of this, but they would kind of have a bit more of an understanding with each other. Eventually an explosion would go off one of these days due to a Nomu, and Aizawa would quickly be making his way to go check it out. Deku would say that he's going to go to a different area to try to check things out, and Aizawa would say whatever. As it would happen, Izuku, making his way away from Aizawa's direction, would realize that he just heard a scream, a gut-curdling scream, which would actually be coming from Ida. And Deku, once hearing this, would immediately make his way towards the alley, hoping that it was Stain. And to his surprise, it was. However, he would see that Stain would be right about to finish off one of his classmates, and Deku, he shoots a gun straight at the knife that Stain was about to use, breaking it. And Stain would jump back after having been shot with that bullet. Deku slowly walking over towards Ida as he kicks him in the head and knocks him out, and then he looks towards the direction of Native as, you know, he knocks him out too with a punch. He then looks towards Stain and says, "The hero killer. Looks like we finally meet. Name's Deathstroke." And, you know, Stain would be like, What are you talking about, kid? Deku would say, "Look, I want to talk to you. I've seen what you're doing. How you're taking out fake heroes. How you want to fix society as in and of itself. I agree with you. After all, I am quirkless." And Stain would say, "Huh, a quirkless individual." Izuku would then stop for a moment as he would realize that Stain would be about to charge at him, and so Stain would do so. Izuku takes his sword out from his back, clashing with Stain and then holding him off easily, showing Stain that he's in another league, and Stain would be completely caught off guard. Deku would say, "Don't interrupt me again," and ultimately he sheathes his sword as he would tell Stain that it's hard to be a quirkless individual in today's society. It's hard to have any quirk that isn't hero-like. This society is not made for many, and he wishes to change it just as much as Stain does. However, he's going about it in the hero way. He likes what Stain's doing and wants him to continue doing that. However, if he was to ever request his services, Deku would just like to have the thought that he could have Stain by his side. And Stain would say that he understands. After hearing Deku's sad backstory and how he trained for so many years, Stain would definitely kind of feel like drawn towards Deku, and he would definitely agree with the ideals that Deku would have. They both share kind of a lot of similar traits, and so they each agree with what is about to happen, you know what I mean? And so Deku, you know, he pretty much ends up just kind of doing the thing with Stain, getting his contact info, and then afterwards, Izuku would grab Ida and Native, calling an ambulance, and right as it would be about to get there, a giant Nomu would come flying in from the sky with wings, as Deku jumps up into the air, stabbing the Nomu straight into the brain and killing it before the Nomu could attack at anybody. Aizawa would have just been arriving in the scene, and seeing how Izuku effortlessly just like committed, like he just killed that Nomu, he would be shocked. Deku is a natural born killer, and Deku's not hiding it. He blatantly just killed that Nomu in front of the hospital and then just played it off like nothing happened. What would pretty much end up happening after this is that they would end up returning to school a couple days later, and eventually they would be told about the final exams. Preparations would be held, and Deku wouldn't have to study considering that his IQ is insanely off the charts, plus he's way past UA university level, so it's fairly easy for Deku to go through with all this. What would pretty much end up happening is that the finals would happen, and Izuku would be pitted up against Aizawa. During this fight, Deku decides to use no guns, no knives, no nothing, just bare hands, and beats down on Aizawa alongside with the help of Momo, who Deku decides is a very good catch. So after the test would happen, Izuku rizzes Momo up, and eventually one thing would lead to another, and Deku would find himself studying geography with Momo in her house, you know, in the living room, in the kitchen, all over the place. But ultimately, after that would happen, Izuku would finally find himself on a train. Now, why are they on a train? Because they're on the way towards the forest training camp, which is going to be taking place right now. During the forest training camp, everything would basically go down just like it would be in the original, so there's no need for me to really cover that, except for the fights. When Deku would see Muscular appearing, and he realizes that Koda is there, Deku, you know, seeing a villain right there and realizing that this villain has tons of murderous bloodlust coming off of him, would just not be playing around. Izuku ultimately decides that this guy's quirk is going to be very hard to fight against, because what he would do is grab a sword and try to cut at Muscular. However, the muscle fibers would be so thick that Deku can't even plunge the sword out or in, and then Muscular would punch Deku away, actually hurting Deku in his arm. Deku would grit his teeth and then ultimately say that UA says he can't use these, but he's gonna do it anyways. And then he pulls the trigger to this gun, right? Now, the gun's bullet would then shoot straight through the head of Muscular, and Muscular falls straight to the ground. Deku says that he's strong and that his quirk is powerful. However, Hero Society has become too reliant on their quirks, and Muscular was definitely not ready for a hero or a pro hero student to whip out a gun and straight just shoot him in the head. So Muscular dies. And ultimately, after the death of Muscular takes place, Deku grabs Koda, takes him to Aizawa, and then makes his way towards the class. The rest of the forest training camp arc goes down just like in the original, until eventually we would have the capturing of Bakugo and Tokiyami. Tokiyami would still be saved in this version, and eventually when we would find ourselves in the situation where Deku is pretty much asked to go save Bakugo, he would decline. He'd say that he doesn't feel like it, and because he would decline, he would easily be able to make his way towards the situation where he expects that the battle will take place. Izuku, getting his all armor on and getting his Deathstroke outfit on, would then make his way towards the direction of the top of a roof, where eventually he would realize that everything would be going down. A bunch of the villains would be captured, and ultimately All For One would make his presence known. While All For One would be monologuing, Izuku would be adjusting his scope, and the bullet would go straight through the air and hit All For One in the back of the head. It would be a silenced sniper, a very, very heavy duty ones that the cops don't have, like one that he would have gotten from like the black market, like the blackest part of the market. That sounded so not cool, but you know what I mean, like a very, 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 very deep part of it, right? It'd be like a rail gun almost, right? And the energy of this bullet that would come off of it would just go straight through All For One's head, killing him instantly, leading All For One to fall to the ground convulsing, and All Might would look around trying to see where the sniper came from, but Deku, using airwalk, would make his way away from the scene as rapid as possible. And the very next day at school, Aizawa would confront Deku, asking him if he was responsible for the death of All For One, and Deku would say he was, as he simply sits down, grabs his phone, and plays some music on his headphones. Aizawa would say that he truly is lucky that this kid wants to be a hero, because if he truly was a villain, there would be pretty much no hope for them. And what Deku would end up doing is essentially, making his way towards the direction of, oh wait, no, he's already in the class. What Deku would do is just pretty much sit in the class, and eventually class would just come by like normal. Because All Might doesn't have to retire as the symbol of peace, he's still around, but eventually they do take the examination for their hero licenses, and they all do end up passing, leading us to the overhaul arc, which during this arc everything would pretty much be fairly simple. I mean, Deku versus Mirio goes down. Deku, I wish I could say, would be able to easily take Mirio out. However, Mirio's ability to become intangible, which wasn't something Deku would be expecting, and his combat approach, since he would have ended up rushing at Deku first, would catch Deku off, and Mirio would be able to punch him one good time, sending him flying to the ground, ultimately leading Deku to wait for Mirio to take out the rest of the students. And then right before Deku and Mirio could have finally gotten into a real fight, Aizawa would stop the fight, fearing for what Deku might have done to Mirio and not really needing to see what Deku's skills are like. Eventually though, Mirio does end up recruiting Deku to come with Sir Night-Eye, and because this time around Deku doesn't have the quirk of All For One for all, Izuku isn't treated with such prejudice by Night-Eye, right? Eventually leading to the encounter which would have happened with Eri in the original, and because Deku was a lot more cold-blooded, him having to leave Eri behind for the sake of the mission was just something that he was easily willing to do. Sacrificing a life for taking out a villain is something that Deku isn't really too afraid of doing. And after this, Deku would get some news that Overhaul is actually responsible for creating bullets which can siphon people's quirks, and Izuku would think that that's awesome. So Izuku goes on the web, tries to find out anything he can about Overhaul, and eventually would end up calling him on the phone. Overhaul gets a random number from an unknown user, and he would answer saying, "Who is this?" Deku would say, "Name's Deathstroke. I'm looking to see if I can get my hands on some of those quirk destroying bullets." And Overhaul would say that he doesn't know what he heard about that, but they're not real or for sale. And Deku would say that he thinks they are, that he knows about a certain individual who was recently hit by them and he wants in. And Overhaul would say that they're not going out to the general public, only he's gonna have his hands on them. Deku would say, "Is that so? Looks like I'm gonna have to take them by force. I was looking to see if maybe me and you could make a deal, but seeing as we can't, I'll be coming for you. Alright, Overhaul? You better watch your back, because when you least expect it, you're gonna have a bullet in your skull." And then he would hang up the phone, and ultimately, then the raid on Overhaul would happen. Deku this time around wouldn't be able to use One For All and just rush through it like he would in the original, and Mirio would still be getting hit with the quirk destroying bullets. However, Deku, who would end up arriving, grabs a gun and straight just starts shooting at the direction of Overhaul. Overhaul is able to react and put up a little barrier of like dirt, and eventually Deku would end up kind of unveiling that he does have a quirk, using his enhanced speed and strength to blitz at the direction of Overhaul and just bink, 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 combo him, you know what I mean? Ultimately shooting him one time in like his appendix area, and then uppercutting Overhaul, grabbing his gun that he had and taking those bullets and just taking samples of them, getting access to the bullets that Overhaul would have used. And ultimately Izuku would finally end up going back to UA, where Mirio and the people who would have ended up arriving last second, seeing that Deku took those bullets and did what he did, would just kind of be like, okay, like we kind of can't cover this up anymore. So they end up hitting up the Hero Commission, and Aizawa kind of betrays Deku, where Deku has like the FBI and a bunch of heroes pull up on him, and you know, they're getting ready to just like take him to prison. And Deku, he just does a 100 IQ move and says, I surrender. He surrenders, the cops take him in, and once he's inside, Izuku would be talked to by a government agent who would tell him that he can either rot in here for the rest of his life, or he can be a gunman for hire for the Japanese government, sorry. And Izuku says, I picked the latter. I'll definitely be a hired gunman for you, but don't think you can hold this dog down. I'm not somebody who can be leashed up like all of your other dogs. And Deku would look at them and say that he agrees, but it's going to be on his terms. And they look at him and they're like, I don't think you understand. We have all the power. Deku, you know, he doesn't have his handcuffs on, and Deku, you know, he would be like, can I get something to drink? I'm parched. They bring him a glass bottle, and Deku would say thanks. As, you know, like Deku just grabs this bottle, breaks it on the thing, and then grabs the guy's guard. Like he'd have like 5 guards around him. That's why they weren't afraid. He slashes his neck, grabs the gun, shoots at the 3 other guys that he had around him, and then looks at the guy with his gun in his hand and says, look, you're taking my demands. Are we clear? And the guy just looks at him and says, sure, kid, we're clear, but you're working for us. As suddenly, Izuku would hear a helicopter up in the air, and he looks up and he would see none other than Stain. He would have ended up sending an SOS signal when he got captured, and Stain would be there waiting for him. Deku jumps on the thing, and then ultimately, he would end up saying that he'll think about their offer. As he flies off with Stain, and he and Stain would pretty much go on to become a duo that just take out corrupted heroes, take out villains, and they become mercenaries for pay. Deku truly and utterly becomes Deathstroke.